Navy Admiral Frank Bradley, the commander who oversaw the September 2nd strikes on an alleged drug boat in the Caribbean, has testified before the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee. The Admiral denied Hegseth gave a, quote, kill everybody order in his briefing to lawmakers. Lawmakers left the briefing with mixed reactions along party lines. Rep. Jim Himes of Connecticut, the senior Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, said after the briefing, quote, I reviewed the strike video and it's deeply, deeply troubling. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, told reporters after the Thursday closed door that these were, quote, righteous strikes. Quite a stark difference, Dad.
Yeah, this is Admiral Bradley's Colin Powell moment. Admiral Bradley is no Colin Powell. Colin Powell was one of the most revered and admired figures in recent American history. I was one of his great admirers. I actually thought, that he could become president of the United States. And then he torpedoed his own reputation, his own standing, by going before the UN and advocating for the disastrous invasion of Iraq based upon exaggerated and faulty intelligence. I was one of the first to comment on that right after his appearance, and I compared it to Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador's appearance when they discovered the missiles in Cuba. And I said, Stevenson had photos. Colin Powell had cartoons. It was just a horrific moment. This is the Colin Powell moment for Bradley, who isn't anywhere near the stature. I never heard of him, frankly. Have you, Sam?
No.
But, those who know him attest to his integrity, his competence. And here he comes before the United States Congress to defend the indefensible, the killing of two survivors of an initial strike that blew the boat apart. No one suggests that this boat was operational. Apparently it was blown in half. It was such a horrendous hit that Pete Hegseth said, I couldn't even see what was going on. It was so much smoke and fire. It was the fog of war. And so you got these two pathetic survivors clinging to the side of the boat. And after 41 minutes of delay, plenty of time to get a helicopter in there to intercept them, which they did later in later strikes. He decides, either on his own, who knows, we may never know, to blow up the boat again and kill the survivors. This is directly contrary to the law of war. You cannot kill survivors of a shipwreck who pose no threat to you. It's also contrary to American law. You cannot kill individuals who pose no threat to you on the grounds that, they may commit a future crime, as absurd as it was. Somehow they were going to get back on the ship, sail half the boat to the United States, unload the drugs, even though we're total surveillance by the American Navy. What possible threat could these two have posed? And Sam, I have not heard this anywhere, but there is a direct precedent demonstrating that Bradley and his superior Hegseth committed a heinous war crime.
Whoa.
This is the famous Peleus, that's P-E-L-E-U-S, something no one's ever heard of, the famous Peleus incident during World War II. Peleus was a Greek freighter conscripted by the British Ministry of Transport. So it was a belligerent ship. It wasn't necessarily a fighting ship, but it was a belligerent ship because it was carrying supplies on behalf of the British, who were then engaged in this horrific war with the Germans, right? You didn't have to come up with some convoluted, unsubstantiated claim that the persons on these boats in the Caribbean or in the Pacific or at war with the United States. There was a war, the worst war in history going on, and the British and the Germans were in the midst of it. Well, in 1944, a U-boat fired torpedoes against the Peleus, the freighter working with the British Ministry of Transport, and basically blew the freighter apart, much like what happened in the Caribbean with the first strike on this little boat. And there were quite a number of survivors, though, out of the 35 crew, clinging to pieces of wreckage. Instead of rescuing them, do you know what the commander and other officers on the submarine did?
I'm guessing they killed them.
They killed all but 3 of them, raking them with machine gun fire and grenades in a deliberate attempt to kill all of the survivors who posed absolutely no threat to anyone on the submarine or the integrity of the submarine itself. Well, the Germans on the submarine were apprehended and tried by a British court and charged with committing a war crime by killing most of the survivors. 5 members of the German crew were on trial. And you know what their argument was, Sam? They had 2 of them. One was summarily dismissed. We were just following orders. As the judge advocate found, that's no excuse. You cannot follow blatantly illegal orders. And in fact, he said, there's no complication here of international law. It is a fundamental usage of war that the killing of unarmed enemies was forbidden as a result of the experience of civilized nations through many centuries to fire so as to kill helpless survivors of a torpedoed ship was a grave breach of the law of the nations. The right to punish persons who broke such rules of law had clearly been recognized for many years. In light of this, the judge advocate also dismissed the second excuse, that we had to kill everybody to make sure that they would not go off and tell the location of the submarine, or if they were picked up in the waters, our enemies would see the location of the submarine. That argument, similar but much stronger than the arguments being made by General Bradley and Pete Hegseth, much stronger. This is action in World War II, the most brutal war in the history of the world. The judge advocate dismissed that as well. The question whether or not a belligerent is entitled to kill an unarmed person for the purpose of saving his own life has been the subject of much discussion. It may be that such circumstances, to save one's own life, could arise in which a killing might be justified. But the court had to consider the facts that emerged from the evidence of this case. That is, there was no danger. The submarine commander and his boat had no possible justifications of self-defense. The judge advocate said, it's quite obvious that no sailor and no soldier can carry with him a library of international law or have immediate access to a professor on that subject who can tell him whether or not a particular command is a lawful one. However, in this case, it does not involve complex questions of international law as to whether or not the command to fire at helpless survivors struggling in the water was lawful. You might well think it would not be fair to hold any of the subordinates accused in this case responsible for what they are alleged to have done. But it is fairly obvious to you that if in fact the carrying out of X command, he was the commander, involved the killing of helpless survivors, it was not a lawful command, and it must have been obvious to the most rudimentary intelligence that it was not a lawful command. And those who did the shooting are not to be excused for any claim for doing it on the ground of superior officers. You know what the verdict was of the 5 men who were tried?
War criminals.
All were found to be war criminals. 3 of them were sentenced to death and executed.
Oh my God, really?
Sentenced to death and executed.
Huh.
In a much less clear situation than that of the blowing up of the 2 survivors on that boat. It's the middle of World War II. Germany and Britain were fighting to the death. There is no question that the boat was involved in working on behalf of the British war machine. And in fact, the court said, we are not accusing you of torpedoing the boat. That was an act of war. You were within your rights to torpedo a ship being used by the British to supply their troops who are fighting the Germans. The war crime occurred afterwards when you killed the helpless, shipwrecked survivors clinging to the wreckage of the boat. Almost exact parallels to what happened in the Caribbean. And none of the excuses that have been given could possibly fly. You know, they were going to right the boat. They were going to, somehow, despite being under the constant surveillance of the U.S. Navy, sail it to the United States and offload the drugs. Much weaker justifications than the Germans had, which is, hey, we don't want to broadcast our location because British destroyers will come and kill us. Well, there's no question of anyone being in danger of being killed as a result of what was going on in the Caribbean. And yet all of those Germans who fired on the survivors were guilty of war crimes, and 3 of them were executed.
Wow, that's a pretty incredible story, Dad. Thanks for sharing that.
And I have not heard that anywhere.
Well, you're the historian guy.
I'm the historian.
You're the expert here, so that's why no one's heard it, except for here on Lichtman Live. I guarantee you Ari Melber is not giving you that story on his show tonight.
Unless he watches us.
Unless he watches us.
The only time you'll hear that story is if someone picks it up by watching us.
I'm getting a little bit worried, though, that this boat strike story is the waters are getting muddied a little bit too much for the average person to be following what's happening. We've got strikes in the Caribbean. We've got 1 strike. We've got 2 strikes. Now, who ordered the strike? Was Hegseth in the room? Was he not in the room? What did Adam? It's getting. I fear it's getting a little bit convoluted. Obviously, the Trump administration is doing that on purpose.
That's their MO. That's what they do, right?
Right.
Delay, obstruct, attack. That's what they do. Obfuscate. But I think one of the reasons I brought up this story, it's dead simple in some ways.
Right.
Take all the complications out of it. It is a war crime to kill helpless survivors of a disabled boat.
And, I hear people justifying killing them by saying, oh, they were drug traffickers, they were drug runners. And show me which law in the United States makes a drug trafficker or a drug runner if they get the death penalty. In this country, even horrific drug traffickers get due process, they get lawyer, they get a judge, and then they get a sentence. They don't get put to death because of it. Yeah. I'm not justifying drug traffickers. I'm just saying.
No, of course not. You can't summarily execute people because you think they're a drug trafficker.
Right,
much less even if you could prove they were a drug trafficker. And in the situation in World War II, no question, the survivors were acting against Germany, right?
Yeah.
Far more direct threat than, these supposed drug runners. And by the way, I'm not an authority on the war on drugs, except I know it's been going on for umpteen decades and done no good. But authorities have said you're not going to make a dent in drug trafficking by blowing up these boats. In fact, you may make the situation worse because, number one, other nations aren't going to want to cooperate with you. And there's been reports that the British have stopped cooperating, and international cooperation is essential for stopping the drug trafficking. Two, by killing everybody, you don't have anyone you can question. There's no way you can, kind of move up the scale. Three, the fentanyl, which, Trump says is killing everyone, doesn't come on these boats. Doesn't come from Venezuela, right? Comes from Colombia and Mexico in other ways. So even if you said, well, there might be some justification if they were, running drugs and killing Americans with fentanyl, just like so many other things in the war on drugs, this appears to be, even if you take at face value their justification, totally counterproductive.
Right. Anything more on the strikes, or do you want to get into the Inspector General report?
Just one quick thing.
Okay.
How many times have they changed their story, right? First, I think it was the Post reports that Hegseth said, kill them all. And they denied that there was even a second strike. Much later, they've also consistently denied that Hegseth said that. We'll never know unless there's some recording. But they even denied there was a second strike, and then it was proven there was a second strike. We have to admit there was another strike. In fact, there might have been several follow-up strikes. And then Hegseth said, well, I followed it all and it was all just fine. And then Hegseth said, I didn't really see it. There was the fog of war, totally inappropriate claim. You could have waited till the smoke cleared. It wasn't that long, and you would have seen exactly what was going on.
Isn't the fog of war in reference to deciding what to do in the scope of an entire war and how confusing it can get?
Thanks for watching our video. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and become a member today.